Under the faint bar light, my wife's crimson lips brushed another's neck. The sight seared into my mind as I stood frozen, gripping the letter I had written her, a plea for us to try again. Her laughter rang out, soft and seductive, as the man's arm curled possessively around her waist. My heart pounded, not with rage, but with a cold finality. I placed the letter gently on the table where she'd see it, and without another word, I left. The door swung shut behind me, sealing the chapter I had desperately hoped to salvage. But before we dive deeper into this gripping story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. If you enjoy this tale of resilience and betrayal, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss another story. The house was quiet, its atmosphere heavy with an unspoken tension that had been simmering for years. The once lively suburban home now seemed to absorb the weariness of its occupants. In the dimly lit kitchen, a single bulb flickered weakly above the granite counter, casting shadows that danced on the walls like restless spirits. The air carried a chill, not from the cold outside, but from the emotional distance that had grown within these walls. Emily sat at the kitchen island, her manicured fingers idly tapping against the sleek marble surface. Her crimson lips curved into a faint, knowing smile as she adjusted the hem of her tailored black dress. She exuded confidence, the kind that could easily be mistaken for arrogance. Every movement was deliberate, her presence commanding attention even in the empty room. Yet her cold demeanor hinted at something darker. A woman accustomed to control, wielding manipulation as effortlessly as she sipped from her crystal wine glass. Across the room, James leaned against the doorframe, his figure partially obscured by the shadows. His shirt was rumpled, the sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms taut with suppressed frustration. He had always been quiet, a man who avoided conflict for the sake of peace. But tonight, there was something different about him. His clenched jaw and piercing gaze betrayed a storm brewing beneath his calm exterior. A storm that had been building for years. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, until Emily finally broke it. "Are you just gonna stand there?" she said, her tone dripping with mockery as she swirled the wine in her glass. "Or do you actually have something to say for once?" James didn't move, his eyes fixed on her. "What's the point?" he replied, his voice low but firm. "You've already made up your mind." Emily's laugh was soft and dismissive, cutting through the room like a blade. James straightened, his fists tightening at his sides. "Outgrown? That's what you call running off with someone like Kyle, trading your family for whatever it is you think he offers?" The mention of Kyle's name sparked a flicker of irritation in Emily's otherwise composed demeanor. She leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. "Kyle is irrelevant," she said, her voice a razor's edge. "This is about me, taking control of my life, something you never had the courage to do." James stepped closer, the faint tremor in his voice replaced by quiet intensity. "Control? You mean lying, stealing, and tearing apart the lives of your own children? That's what you call control?" Emily's smile returned, though it didn't reach her eyes. "Oh, please, spare me the lecture, James. Jack and Ava will be fine. Kids are resilient, and they'll adapt. You, on the other hand..." She trailed off, her gaze drifting over him with disdain. Before James could respond, the sound of a car engine hummed outside, its headlights casting fleeting beams across the window. Emily didn't need to look to know who it was. The door opened moments later and Kyle stepped inside, his leather jacket glinting faintly under the weak kitchen light. His charm was effortless, his cocky grin perfectly intact. "Am I interrupting?" he asked, his tone light but laced with amusement. "Not at all," Emily said smoothly, rising from her seat. She walked toward Kyle, her movements slow and deliberate. James was just about to excuse himself. Kyle raised an eyebrow, his gaze flicking to James. "Ah, the family man. How's it going?" James didn't answer. Instead, he turned, his footsteps heavy as he left the room. Emily watched him go, a faint smirk tugging at her lips. Kyle leaned closer to her, his voice low. You sure he's not going to be a problem? Emily's eyes glittered with confidence. James? No. He doesn't have it in him. But in the darkened hallway, James's fists unclenched as he pulled his phone from his pocket, his jaw set with determination. For the first time, he wasn't walking away. He was taking action. The night James stumbled upon the first clue was ordinary in every other way. He had come home late after another grueling day at work, the house silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. Emily had already retreated upstairs, her evening glass of wine conspicuously absent on the counter. It was unusual for her to leave without finishing it, a detail that stuck in James's mind as he moved through the dimly lit kitchen. As he tidied up the counter, he noticed a crumpled receipt tucked under a stack of unopened mail. At first, it seemed inconsequential, but curiosity made him smooth out the paper. It was from an upscale boutique, one far beyond what their agreed budget allowed. The itemized list showed purchases of expensive handbags, jewelry, and perfume. James frowned, recalling that Emily had recently assured him they needed to tighten their finances. The receipt alone wasn't damning, but it planted the first seed of suspicion. James decided to dig deeper. That weekend, while Emily was out running errands, he sat down at the dining room table with their shared financial records. Logging into their joint bank account, he began scrolling through recent transactions. At first, everything seemed normal. Grocery bills, utilities, and school expenses for Jack and Ava. But as he delved further back, he noticed several large withdrawals to a new account he didn't recognize. One particular transfer caught his attention. $10,000 moved from their savings account just 2 weeks earlier. His stomach churned as he cross-referenced the dates. That amount coincided with a weekend Emily had claimed to be visiting a friend out of town. In a letter, she gave up $10,000, showing how she was depressed by the pandemic. James's heart raced as he opened the account details. It was in Emily's name, listed under a secondary email address he didn't recognize. The balance was substantial, money he had worked hard to save, now hidden away without his knowledge. Determined to uncover the truth, James searched for Emily's phone while she showered one evening. His fingers trembled as he unlocked the screen. He still remembered the passcode from years of shared trust. The messages confirmed what the financial records had hinted at. There were texts to someone named Kay, brief but revealing. Emily, can't wait to be done with this mess. The transfer's complete, everything's in place. Good, we'll celebrate once the papers are signed. Further messages referenced meetings at a hotel downtown, and one included a forwarded email with the subject line, custody negotiations. Emily's reply chilled James to his core. Emily will frame him as unstable. If he pushes back, I'll make sure the kids side with me. James's hands clenched into fists as he read the words. It wasn't just about money. Emily was strategizing to take Jack and Ava away from him entirely. James knew he needed proof. He couldn't confront Emily without solid evidence, not when she was so adept at twisting situations to her advantage. That's when he called Sam, an old friend from his college days who now worked in private security. "I need your help," James admitted over the phone, his voice tight with desperation. "Emily's planning something. She's hiding money, plotting custody. I need to know exactly what's going on." Sam hesitated before responding. "I can send you some equipment. A tracker, a bug. You're sure you want to go this route?" "I don't have a choice," James said firmly. A discreet package arrived the next morning. Inside were a small GPS tracker, a listening device, and instructions for how to use them. That evening, James waited until Emily left the house, her heels clicking confidently down the driveway. Once her car disappeared around the corner, he grabbed the tracker and crouched beneath her car, carefully attaching it to the undercarriage. Next, he slipped the listening device into her favorite handbag, a designer piece she carried everywhere. It nestled snugly into the lining, invisible to the eye. Over the following days, James monitored the tracker and bug. The GPS revealed Emily's frequent trips to a high-end apartment building across town. It didn't take long to confirm that Kay was Kyle, and the two were meeting almost daily. The listening device painted an even grimmer picture. In one recorded conversation, Emily and Kyle discussed their plans openly. Emily: "Once the divorce is finalized, I'll take the house in full custody. James won't know what hit him. And the money, he's not suspicious?" Emily: "He's clueless. Even if he figures it out, he doesn't have the guts to fight me in court." James listened to the recordings with a mix of heartbreak and fury. Emily's voice was calm, detached, so confident in her ability to manipulate and win. But James felt something shift within himself. For the first time, he wasn't paralyzed by her cruelty. He was determined to fight back. Armed with the financial records, messages, and audio evidence, James compiled a detailed case. He stored everything in a locked folder on his computer, labeled simply, "For Jack and Ava." He knew the battle ahead would be difficult, but the evidence was undeniable. Emily's schemes were exposed, and James was ready to fight for the one thing that mattered most: his children. The sharp morning light streamed through the blinds as Emily rummaged through her handbag, searching for her phone. Her perfectly manicured fingers brushed against something unfamiliar, a small, hard object wedged in the lining. Her brow furrowed as she worked it free, pulling out a tiny black device. For a moment, she simply stared at it, her mind racing to comprehend its purpose. Then, it hit her: a listening device. Emily's pulse quickened, her breath catching in her throat. She turned the device over in her hand, fury igniting like a spark to dry tinder. James. It had to be him. The realization churned in her stomach, a sickening mix of anger and panic. Tossing the bug onto the counter, she stormed into the garage, her heels clicking furiously against the tiles. She crouched beside her car, inspecting it with calculated precision. Her fingers skimmed along the edges of the bumper until she found it. A GPS tracker securely fastened to the undercarriage. With a forceful yank, she tore it off, her hands trembling. Her reflection in the car window stared back at her, her composed mask cracking under the weight of her discovery. In her mind, she traced the synaptic lines back into the feeling of belonging she had felt chased, familiar, divorced from herself. Emily stormed back into the house, clutching the devices like evidence at a trial. Her heels echoed sharply as she crossed the kitchen, throwing the bug and tracker onto the table. The sound of the front door opening announced James's return. "Care to explain these?" she snapped, her voice venomous. "No." James paused in the doorway, his expression calm but unreadable. His eyes flicked to the table, then back to Emily. "I see you've been busy," he said evenly, closing the door behind him. "Don't play coy with me, James," Emily spat, her voice rising. "You've been spying on me? Tracking my car? What the hell is wrong with you?" James stepped forward, his hands in his pockets. "What's wrong with me?" he repeated, his tone sharp but controlled. "What's wrong is that you've been lying, Emily. Stealing from our accounts, plotting with Kyle, and planning to take the kids away from me. I had to find out the truth, because you've never been honest about anything." Emily's lips curled into a bitter smile, though her eyes burned with fury. "Oh, you're the victim now? Spying on me is your idea of honesty? That's rich." "Don't twist this around," James shot back, his voice rising for the first time. "I didn't plant those devices because I wanted to. I did it because I had no other choice. You've been planning this for months, haven't you? Manipulating everything to suit your needs, just like always." Emily crossed her arms, her facade of control slipping further. "So what if I have? You've spent years letting me do it. Don't act like you suddenly grew a spine, James." "I'm not the same man you think I am," James said, his jaw tightening, "and you're not as untouchable as you think." The silence between them crackled with tension, each refusing to back down. Then Emily's phone buzzed on the counter, breaking the standoff. She grabbed it, her hand trembling as she read the message from Kyle. "We need to talk. Now." Her stomach twisted. "Kyle." She realized with a sinking feeling that he might already sense things were unraveling. Safe. In Kyle's sleek apartment, Emily paced the room, clutching her wine glass. "He's been spying on me, Kyle. He knows too much." Kyle leaned against the counter, arms crossed, his usual smirk replaced by a cautious frown. "I warned you this might happen, didn't I? You've been getting sloppy." "Sloppy?" Emily snapped, turning on him. "This isn't my fault. James is supposed to be spineless, predictable. I didn't expect him to fight back like this." Kyle raised an eyebrow. "And now that he is? What's your plan, Emily? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like he's got the upper hand." Emily slammed her glass onto the counter, the sound sharp and final. "He doesn't have anything. I can still control this. We'll frame him. Make it look like he's the one endangering the kids. The courts always side with the mother." Kyle hesitated, his confidence in her wavering. "You sure about that? If he's already found this much, who's to say he won't find more? I'm not going down with you if this blows up." Emily's eyes narrowed, her fury now tinged with desperation. "Then stick to the plan, Kyle, because I'm not letting him win." As she spoke, a sliver of doubt crept into her mind. For the first time, she wondered if James had become a bigger threat than she was prepared to face. The warm glow of the safe house fireplace flickered against the wood-paneled walls, casting long shadows as James sat at the dining table, poring over the evidence he'd collected. The stack of papers and digital recordings in front of him was meticulously organized, each piece damning in its revelation of Emily's betrayal. Across the table, Sam leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed, observing James with a steady gaze. "This is solid," Sam said, breaking the heavy silence. "The financial records alone are enough to raise serious questions, not to mention the recordings of her and Kyle. Any competent lawyer could use this to get you a favorable ruling." James nodded, but didn't look up. His fingers tapped nervously against a printout of Emily's bank transfers. "It's not enough to win," he muttered. "She'll do whatever it takes to twist this in her favor. She always has a backup plan." Sam leaned forward, his voice firm but reassuring. "That's why we're doing this by the book. The court isn't going to side with her if we show a clear pattern of manipulation and neglect. But you need to be ready, James. She's going to fight dirty." James's jaw tightened, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. "I'm not just fighting for myself," he said quietly. "This is for Jack and Ava. I can't let her use them as pawns in her game." Sam studied him for a moment before pulling out his phone. "I've got a contact, an attorney who specializes in cases like this. She's tough, and she knows how to handle people like Emily. I'll set up a meeting." "Thanks," James said, his voice steady but grateful. "I need every advantage I can get." Meanwhile, across town, Emily paced the length of Kyle's apartment, her mind racing. The wine glass in her hand trembled slightly, though she would never admit it was from anything other than frustration. Kyle sat on the couch, scrolling through his phone, his usual smug demeanor replaced with a wary caution. "I need to take control of this," Emily said sharply, her voice cutting through the room. "James thinks he's clever, but he doesn't understand who he's dealing with." Kyle glanced up, an eyebrow raised. "You're sure about that? Because from where I'm sitting, he's doing a pretty good job of getting under your skin." Emily shot him a withering glare. "He's desperate, that's all. Desperate people make mistakes, and when he does, I'll be ready." Kyle sighed, setting his phone down. "So, what's your big plan then? You can't just wait for him to slip up. He's already ahead of you." Emily's lips curled into a cold smile. "I don't need to wait. I'll make my move first. If James wants a fight, I'll give him one." Kyle frowned. "And what exactly does that mean?" Emily set her glass down and leaned over the table, her voice lowering to a conspiratorial whisper. "He took the kids, didn't he? That's kidnapping. I'll call the police. Report him for taking them without my consent. It'll throw him off balance, make him look like the bad guy." Kyle hesitated, the doubt evident in his expression. "That's risky. If the courts find out he had legal custody, it could backfire. You sure you want to play that card?" I don't have a choice, Emily snapped, her composure cracking for just a moment. If I don't act now, he'll destroy everything. I've worked too hard to let him win. Kyle studied her, his usual smirk gone. All right, he said finally. But don't expect me to clean up the mess if this goes sideways. He silently walked off. Back at the safe house, James paced the living room, his phone pressed to his ear. The attorney Sam had recommended was on the other end, her tone brisk and professional. You've got a strong case, she said, her voice steady. But you need to act quickly. Emily will retaliate. People like her always do. Have you filed for emergency custody yet? I'm in the process, James replied, glancing toward the room where Jack and Ava were playing. I've got the paperwork ready, but I wanted to make sure everything's airtight before I submit it. Good, the attorney said. Once it's filed, the court will see that you're acting in the children's best interests. But be prepared. Emily won't take this lying down. James hung up just as Sam entered the room carrying a cup of coffee. Everything set? Sam asked. James nodded. The lawyer's confident, but she's right. Emily's going to come at me with everything she's got. Sam handed him the coffee and clapped a hand on his shoulder. Then let her. You've got the truth on your side. And you're not alone in this. The next morning, Emily stood in the police station, her expression carefully calculated to appear distraught. She leaned against the counter, her voice trembling as she spoke to the officer on duty. My husband, she said, her eyes brimming with crocodile tears. He's taken my children. I don't know where they are. Please, you have to help me. The officer frowned, taking notes. Do you have a custody agreement in place, ma'am? Emily hesitated for the briefest moment before shaking her head. We were working through things, she said, her voice faltering. But he's unstable. I'm afraid for my children's safety. The officer nodded, his expression serious. We'll open a case. If you can provide any details about his whereabouts, it will help us locate him. Emily's lips curled into a faint smile, hidden by the pretense of worry. She left the station feeling victorious, convinced that her plan was already working. That evening, James received an unexpected knock at the door. Sam opened it cautiously, revealing two uniformed officers. Mr. Walker, one of them asked, stepping forward. We've received a report that you've taken your children without their mother's consent. We need to discuss this. James's heart sank, but he forced himself to remain calm. I have legal custody, he said, retrieving the court documents from the table. Everything is in order. The officer scanned the papers, his frown deepening as he read. These appear to be valid. We'll need to verify them, but it seems there's been a misunderstanding. The man signed over his printout. Emily's plan had failed to shake James, but the encounter only reinforced his determination. As the officers left, James turned to Sam, his expression grim but resolute. She's not going to stop, he said, but neither am I. The safe house was quiet. The soft crackle of the fireplace the only sound as James sat at the dining table, reviewing his notes. Jack and Ava were playing in the adjacent room, their laughter a comforting reminder of why he was fighting so hard. Sam was nearby, keeping a watchful eye on the property, his presence a reassuring anchor for James. The peace was shattered by the sound of crunching gravel outside. James's head snapped up, his heart pounding as headlights pierced through the drawn curtains. A second later, there was a loud knock on the door, firm and authoritative. Sam appeared in the doorway, his face grim. Police, he said quietly. And Emily's with them. James closed his eyes for a brief moment, steeling himself. Stay with the kids, he instructed. I'll handle this. He walked to the door, his hands trembling slightly as he reached for the handle. When he opened it, the sight before him sent a jolt of adrenaline coursing through his veins. Two uniformed officers stood on the porch, their faces professional but alert. Behind them was Emily, her arms crossed, her expression a mix of smug satisfaction and barely contained fury. Mr. Walker, one of the officers asked, his tone neutral but firm. We've received a report that you've taken your children without their mother's consent. We need to talk." James exhaled slowly, his mind racing. "I understand," he said calmly. "But there's been a misunderstanding. I have legal custody of my children." Emily stepped forward, her voice cutting through the cold night air like a blade. "Misunderstanding? Are you serious? You took them without telling me. That's kidnapping, James." "Ma'am, please," one of the officers said, holding up a hand to silence her. He turned back to James. "Do you have any documentation to prove custody?" James nodded, stepping aside to retrieve a folder from the nearby table. He handed it to the officer, his hand steady despite the storm raging inside him. "These are the court documents," he said. "Issued just a few days ago. They grant me temporary full custody of Jack and Ava." The officer took the papers and began reviewing them carefully. The second officer glanced at Emily, who was visibly fuming, her carefully composed facade beginning to crack. "This is ridiculous," she snapped, her voice rising. "He manipulated the court. He's been spying on me, planting devices, and now he's trying to steal my children." James met her glare, his voice calm but firm. "The court didn't need manipulation, Emily. They saw the truth. Your financial schemes, your plans to use Jack and Ava as leverage. I didn't take them to hurt you. I took them to protect them." Emily's face turned red, her anger boiling over. "Protect them? From me? Don't make me laugh, James. You're the one hiding out in some cabin, making yourself look like the hero." The officer holding the documents cleared his throat, drawing their attention. "Mr. Walker," he said, his tone now softer, "these papers appear to be legitimate. They do grant you temporary custody. Ma'am," he continued, turning to Emily, "if you were unaware of this court order, you'll need to take it up with the family court. As of now, Mr. Walker is acting within his legal rights." Emily's eyes widened in disbelief. "You can't be serious. He's been planning this for weeks, months even. He's trying to take everything from me." "Ma'am," the second officer said firmly, "we can't intervene in a custody matter when there's a valid court order in place. You need to address this through the legal system." James felt a flicker of relief but kept his focus. "Emily," he said, his voice measured, "you don't have to make this worse than it already is. The kids deserve better than this. Better than us fighting like this." Emily's hands balled into fists at her sides. "You think you're winning, don't you?" she hissed, her voice trembling with rage. "This isn't over, James. You might have the law on your side right now, but I'll find a way. You'll regret this." James's gaze didn't waver. "This isn't about winning. It's about what's best for Jack and Ava. And they need stability, not schemes and manipulation." The officers exchanged a glance before one of them stepped forward. "Ma'am, I suggest you leave for now. This situation isn't something we can resolve here." Emily's mouth opened as if to argue, but she stopped herself. Her eyes burned with anger, and for a moment James saw something else. Fear. She turned on her heel and marched toward her car, the crunch of gravel under her heels sharp and uneven. The pain would be much, but the peace would come later. As she opened the driver's side door, she paused, looking back at James one last time. "Don't think this is the end," she said, her voice low and venomous. "You're going to pay for this." James watched her drive away, her taillights disappearing into the darkness. He turned back to the officers, who handed him the folder with a nod of acknowledgement. "Thank you," James said quietly. The officers left soon after, leaving the cabin once again in silence. James stood at the door, staring out into the night, his emotions a whirlwind of relief, exhaustion, and determination. He knew this wasn't over, but tonight he had won an important battle. Sam appeared at his side, his expression unreadable. "You did good," he said simply. James nodded, his jaw tight. "It's not just for me. It's for them," he said, glancing toward the room where Jack and Ava were sleeping soundly. For the first time in years, James felt a flicker of hope. Emily might not give up. But neither would he. This time, he was ready. The courtroom was a solemn space, its high ceilings and mahogany paneling exuding an air of authority. Sunlight filtered through tall windows, highlighting the judge's stern face as she reviewed the documents in front of her. On one side sat James, his posture straight, his hands clasped tightly together. Beside him, his attorney shuffled through a meticulously organized binder filled with evidence. On the other side, Emily sat stiffly, her expression a mask of disdain. Her lawyer leaned in, whispering reassurances, but she barely acknowledged him, her eyes fixed on James. The judge cleared her throat, her voice echoing in the quiet room. This is a hearing to address custody arrangements for the Walker children, Jack and Ava. Both parties have submitted evidence and testimony. We will now hear from Mr. Walker. James stood, his attorney giving him a small nod. He approached the witness stand, his movements deliberate and steady. Taking the oath, he glanced briefly at Emily before speaking. Your Honor, he began, his voice calm but filled with conviction. I am here to prove that the best interests of my children lie in granting me custody. Over the past several months, I've uncovered evidence that demonstrates not only financial mismanagement, but also emotional neglect on the part of their mother. His attorney stood and addressed the court. We'd like to present Exhibit A, she said, holding up a stack of bank statements. These records show significant withdrawals from the family's joint accounts, funds that were diverted to a separate account in Mrs. Walker's name without Mr. Walker's knowledge. The judge studied the documents as James continued. That money was meant for our children's future, college funds, emergency savings. Instead, it was used to fund a lifestyle that prioritized Emily's personal desires over our family's needs. Emily's lawyer rose, attempting to object. Your Honor, these transactions are not relevant to Mrs. Walker's ability to parent. The judge raised a hand, silencing him. Overruled. Continue. James's attorney stepped forward with a USB drive. Next, we'd like to play an audio recording, Your Honor. This was obtained legally and highlights a conversation between Mrs. Walker and a third party, Kyle Bennett. As the recording played, the courtroom fell silent. Emily's voice rang out, calm and calculating. Emily, once the divorce is finalized, I'll take the house, the kids, and everything else. James won't see it coming. And if he fights back? Emily, he won't. He's too weak. I'll make sure the kids think it's for the best. Emily's face turned pale as the words echoed in the room. She shifted uncomfortably, her composure slipping for the first time. Her lawyer leaned in, whispering furiously, but she ignored him. James took a deep breath before speaking again. Your Honor, these recordings show a clear intent to manipulate not only me, but also our children. She has treated them as tools in her schemes, rather than as individuals who deserve stability and love. The judge turned to Emily, her expression stern. Mrs. Walker, do you have anything to say in response to these allegations? Emily stood abruptly, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and desperation. This is all taken out of context. James has been spying on me, invading my privacy. He's the one manipulating things. Her outburst drew murmurs from the courtroom. The judge rapped her gavel once, silencing the room. Mrs. Walker, you'll have your chance to respond through your counsel. Please sit down. Emily sat, her jaw clenched, her eyes darting around the room as if searching for an escape. The walls seemed to be closing in. James's attorney presented the final piece of evidence, testimony from Jack's teacher, who had noted a marked improvement in his behavior and mood since staying with James. This supports Mr. Walker's claim that the children thrive in his care, she concluded. The judge leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. After a pause, she spoke. The evidence presented paints a concerning picture of Mrs. Walker's behavior. Financial impropriety, recorded intentions to manipulate custody, and a pattern of neglectful decision-making compel this court to prioritize the well-being of the children. She turned to James. Temporary full custody is granted to Mr. Walker, pending further review. Mrs. Walker, you will have supervised visitation rights until this court determines otherwise." The gavel struck and the decision was final. Emily's face crumbled. Her lips quivered, and tears welled in her eyes, but they weren't tears of remorse. They were tears of fury and disbelief. She turned to her lawyer, who merely shook his head, unwilling to meet her gaze. James exhaled, a mix of relief and sadness washing over him as he looked toward the future. Emily's life unraveled swiftly in the weeks following the court ruling. Kyle, sensing the growing scrutiny, disappeared without a word, leaving her to face the fallout alone. The social circles she had once commanded with icy charm turned cold, whispers of her deceit and court defeat spreading like wildfire. Her financial accounts were frozen, leaving her scrambling to pay for even basic expenses. The lavish lifestyle she had fought so hard to maintain crumbled, each lost luxury a sharp reminder of her collapse. In her now empty house, Emily sat by the window, staring blankly at the street. Her reflection in the glass was a ghost of the woman she once pretended to be. She was no longer the confident manipulator. She was isolated, defeated, and drowning in the consequences of her actions. As the days stretched into weeks, Emily began to understand the true cost of her schemes. It wasn't just her social status or money. It was the trust of those she claimed to care about, the family she had sacrificed for her ambitions. The silence of the house echoed her regret, a stark reminder of the life she had destroyed with her own hands. The new house wasn't extravagant, but to James it felt like a sanctuary. Nestled in a quiet neighborhood, the modest home had a cozy front porch with hanging flower baskets and a small yard where Jack and Ava could play. The inside was warm and inviting, filled with natural light streaming through large windows and the faint smell of fresh paint. It was a far cry from the tense, hollow environment they had left behind, but it was perfect for their fresh start. James stood in the kitchen one Saturday morning, flipping pancakes on the stovetop, while Ava perched on a stool, eagerly mixing a bowl of batter. Jack sat at the kitchen table, sketching a dragon in his notebook, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Careful, Ava," James said with a chuckle as she almost spilled the bowl. "We don't want pancake batter on the ceiling." Ava giggled, her ponytail bouncing as she stirred. "But Daddy, the mess is the fun part." Jack looked up from his drawing. "Yeah, Dad. Isn't that what you always say about painting?" He grinned, and James couldn't help but smile back. "Fair enough," James replied, flipping a pancake onto a growing stack. "But you two are cleaning up afterward." And their mornings often started like this, filled with laughter, the smell of breakfast, and the gentle hum of a family rediscovering joy. James had made a point to establish routines that brought comfort and predictability to their days. Each step felt like a small victory in their journey towards stability. Afternoons were just as lively. After picking up Jack and Ava from school, James would help them with their homework at the dining table. Ava, with her love of stories, often turned her spelling lessons into dramatic retellings of fairy tales. Jack, ever the perfectionist, would meticulously work through his math problems, occasionally asking James for help. "Dad, how do I find the perimeter again?" Jack asked one evening, holding up a worksheet. James crouched beside him, pointing at the problem. "Just add up all the sides of the shape. See, if this side is 5 and this one is 7, what do you get when you add them?" 12, Jack said, his eyes lighting up with understanding. "Thanks, Dad." James ruffled Jack's hair affectionately. "You're getting better at this every day." Later, they'd all gather in the living room, where a stack of books and board games waited. One of Ava's favorites was a book about adventures in space, and she loved when James used funny voices for the characters. Jack, on the other hand, preferred chess, and had recently started beating James in nearly every match. Dinner was always a family affair. James made it a priority to involve Jack and Ava in the process, hoping to teach them the value of working together. On most nights, Ava would insist on setting the table, while Jack chopped vegetables under James's watchful eye. "Dad, does this look right?" Jack asked, holding up a lopsided cucumber slice. "Looks perfect to me," James said with a grin. "It's not about being perfect. It's about trying." As they ate, they shared stories about their day. Ava recounted a funny moment at school when her teacher accidentally spilled water on his notes, while Jack excitedly talked about his science project on volcanoes. "Can we make a volcano at home, Dad?" Jack asked, his eyes bright with excitement. "Of course," James said. "How about this weekend? We'll turn the backyard into a science lab." The idea earned cheers from both kids, and James felt a surge of gratitude for these moments. Simple, yet profound in their normalcy. At night, James tucked Ava and Jack into bed, a ritual that had become one of the most cherished parts of his day. Ava always requested a bedtime story, and tonight she had picked one about a brave fox exploring the woods. "Do you think the fox is scared?" Ava asked, her eyes wide as James read. "Maybe a little," James said, closing the book. "But being brave doesn't mean you're never scared. It means you keep going, even when you are." Ava nodded solemnly, as if absorbing a life lesson. "Like you, Dad?" James paused, his throat tightening. He smiled and kissed her forehead. "Like all of us, sweetheart." Jack, a little older and more independent, preferred to read before bed. But tonight, as James passed his room, Jack called out. He wanted to know what was about to kill him. "Dad, thanks for everything," he said, his voice quiet but sincere. James leaned against the door frame, his heart swelling. "You don't have to thank me, buddy. I'm just doing my job." Jack smiled and returned to his book, and James walked to his own room, feeling a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. In the weeks that followed, their home became a place of healing. Therapy sessions helped Jack and Ava process the changes in their lives, while James worked through his own emotions. He began to realize that the stability and love they were building together were the greatest gifts he could offer his children. On sunny afternoons, they played in the backyard, laughing as they chased each other through the grass. On rainy days, they built forts out of blankets and pillows, sharing snacks and telling stories inside their cozy hideaway. Nowadays, the tension and chaos that had once defined their family life were gone, replaced by moments of connection and trust. Each day brought new challenges, but James faced them with the quiet determination that had carried him this far. As he watched Jack and Ava laughing together one evening, their faces lit by the warm glow of a setting sun, James felt a deep sense of fulfillment. Their lives weren't perfect, but they were theirs, full of love, stability, and the promise of a brighter future. The house was silent. Too silent. Emily sat on the edge of the couch in the living room, staring at the empty wine glass on the coffee table in front of her. The furniture, once arranged meticulously to impress visitors, now seemed cold and lifeless, much like the life she had built. The soft ticking of the wall clock was the only sound, each second stretching endlessly, a reminder of the emptiness surrounding her. The curtains hung slightly askew, their once pristine fabric now dull with dust. Emily used to pride herself on keeping the house perfect, every detail a reflection of the image she worked so hard to maintain. But now, she couldn't bring herself to care. The vibrant energy that once defined her world was gone, leaving only shadows and echoes of what had been. She stood and wandered into the kitchen, her bare feet making soft noises against the cold tile floor. Opening the fridge, she found it nearly empty. A carton of milk, a few wilted vegetables, and a single bottle of water. The sight struck her harder than she expected. This fridge, like her life, had once been full, overflowing with indulgences, options, and plans. Now it mirrored the stark reality of her existence, barren and forgotten. She found that she tended to bang on the fridge when she noticed it was empty. Emily closed the door with a sigh, her gaze drifting to the stack of unopened mail on the counter. Bills, overdue notices, and final warnings, Each envelope was another nail in the coffin of the life she had tried so desperately to hold on to. She picked one up, her hands trembling slightly as she opened it. Another credit card canceled, another lifeline severed. She moved to the dining room, where a single chair sat out of place at the long table. It used to be where she would host dinner parties, her sharp wit and carefully curated charm dazzling friends and acquaintances. Now, the table was bare, the once inviting space transformed into a stark reminder of her isolation. Emily sank into the chair, her mind wandering to the people who had filled this house with laughter and admiration. Her friends, if they could even be called that, had stopped calling weeks ago. At first, they offered sympathy when word of the custody battle spread. But as the details of her schemes emerged, the invitations stopped. The whispered gossip had turned into outright avoidance. The Emily they had admired was no more. In her place was a woman stripped of her power, her influence, and her pride. Kyle's betrayal stung the most. She had thought him a partner, someone who shared her ambitions and would stand by her side. But when the scrutiny intensified and the courts began freezing her accounts, he disappeared without a word. His phone number was disconnected, his apartment empty. He had used her just as much as she had used others, and she hated him for it. Hated herself even more for trusting him. The silence pressed down on her, growing heavier with each passing moment. She stood and wandered upstairs to her bedroom. The room was immaculate, untouched since the day she lost custody of Jack and Ava. She sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the framed photo on the nightstand. It was an old picture, taken during a happier time. Jack and Ava were smiling, their arms wrapped around her shoulders. She barely recognized the woman in the photo, a version of herself that had seemed so distant now. The problem was that without a purpose, she was left wandering in the world. Tears welled in her eyes as she traced her fingers over the glass. "What have I done?" she whispered, her voice cracking. She had justified her actions for so long, telling herself it was all for her children, for their future. But deep down, she knew the truth. Her manipulations had never been about them. They had been about control, about proving she could have it all. But in the end, she had lost everything. Her children were gone, living with James in a house filled with the love and stability she had failed to provide. Her social circle had abandoned her, unwilling to be associated with her fall from grace. Her finances were in ruins, every account frozen or empty. The carefully constructed life she had built was nothing more than a fragile facade, shattered beyond repair. For the first time in years, Emily allowed herself to feel the full weight of her choices. The lies, the schemes, the betrayals. They had all led her here, to this empty house and this hollow existence. She had spent so long blaming others, James, her children, even Kyle, that she had never stopped to confront her own role in her downfall. Her tears fell freely now, soaking into the fabric of her dress. She felt small, insignificant, a shadow of the woman she had once pretended to be. The silence of the house seemed to mock her, amplifying her loneliness. But beneath the despair there was a flicker of something else. Regret. For all her mistakes, for all the pain she had caused, Emily realized she wanted to change. She didn't know how or where to start, but the thought of doing nothing, of remaining in this void, was unbearable. She picked up the phone, her fingers hesitating over the keypad. There was no one to call, no one to fix what she had broken. For the first time, she faced the reality of her life without illusions. The path to redemption, if it even existed, would be long and uncertain. But Emily had no choice but to try. The silence around her pressed in once more, but this time she met it with determination. The morning sunlight filtered through the kitchen window, casting a warm, golden glow over the table where James and his children sat. Jack was carefully arranging his toast into the shape of a spaceship, while Ava giggled uncontrollably at the sticky mess she had made with her syrup. James watched them, his heart swelling with a sense of victory that had nothing to do with court rulings or legal battles. This moment, simple, quiet, and full of laughter, was the culmination of his journey. Every sleepless night, every doubt, every hard decision had led to this, a life where Jack and Ava could feel safe, loved, and free to be themselves. James leaned back in his chair, sipping his coffee as he took it all in. The fight had been exhausting, and the scars of the past still lingered. But for the first time in years, he felt strong, not in spite of his struggles, but because of them. The resilience he had discovered in himself, the determination to protect his children no matter what, had carried him through. Later that day, as he helped Jack with his science project and cheered Ava on as she practiced cartwheels in the yard, James realized something profound. The battles he had fought weren't just about custody or proving himself. They were about becoming the kind of father his children could always rely on. That knowledge was his greatest triumph. The evening sun dipped low on the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. James stood on the back porch, watching Jack and Ava chase each other around the yard, their laughter ringing out like music. The air was warm and filled with the faint scent of freshly cut grass, a reminder of life's small, beautiful moments. "Catch me if you can," Ava squealed, darting behind a tree. Jack followed, his shouts of playful determination echoing through the yard. James smiled, leaning against the porch railing, his coffee forgotten in his hand. It wasn't just their laughter that warmed his heart. It was what it represented: healing, resilience, the promise of a brighter future. "Dad, come play with us," Jack called, waving enthusiastically. James hesitated, then set his mug down and stepped into the grass. Ava shrieked with delight as he joined the chase, his arms outstretched to catch her. Jack's laugh was infectious as they weaved between trees and bushes, the worries of the past melting away with every step. As twilight settled over the yard, they collapsed onto the grass, breathless but grinning. James lay back, staring at the first stars appearing in the sky, his children beside him. For the first time in years, the world felt right. He had fought for what truly mattered, and now, surrounded by laughter and love, he found contentment. It wasn't perfection, but it was enough. More than enough. This was the life he had dreamed of, and he was ready to embrace it with open arms.